Our topic for today is on the basic principles of social psychology. Kung matatandaan ninyo, ano bang ibig sabihin ng social psychology? Isa itong subspecialization in psychology where we try to focus more on how the mind functions with other people. Kasi alam nyo, iba talaga ang behavior ng mind kapag mag-isa tayo versus kapag meron tayong kasama. And I think everyday experience will tell you na totoo ito, di ba? Iba ang ugali natin usually kapag mag-isa tayo versus marami tayong mga taong kasama. And in social psychology, we try to focus on the context where the mind is with other people. Ano ba yung mga iba't ibang mga psychological dynamics that happen when the mind is in the group context? Kapag kasama mo yung kaibigan mo, kapag kasama mo yung family mo, kapag kasama mo yung church friends mo, how do you differ compared to when you are just alone? Yan yung pinag-uusapan natin in social psychology. Now, let's go to the word principles kasi nga yung title natin ngayon, Basic Principles in Social Psychology. Ibig sabihin ng principles, these are basic assumptions of truths na pinagpapalagay nating totoo. So, principles are statements of truth, mga bagay, mga statements na sinasabi nating totoo. And usually, ang pinaka-purpose ng principles is for us to achieve a goal. And this goal is something that is good. For example, sa basketball, we follow the ball movement principle. Naniniwala tayo na kapag ang bola umiikot sa mga magkakampi, nagiging maganda ang laro ng basketball, mas tumataas yung chance that that team will win the game. Because when you move the ball around, lahat nakakahawak ng bola, nagpapahina ito ng depensa ng kalaban sa basketball. And when the defense become weak, there is a higher chance that your team will be able to score points. So the ball movement principle is being followed for us to win more games in basketball. Ganun din naman sa social psychology, di ba? Bakit ba tayo gumagamit ng mga basic principles in social psychology? Because we would like to influence people. Remember, ang pinaka-goal sa social psychology is we want to study how people are influenced. How the self or how the person influence other people and how other people can influence the self. So ano ba yung mga effective principles na dapat nating tandaan para maintindihan natin how influence works? So yan yung pag-uusapan natin for today in this lecture. I am going to discuss three basic principles in social psychology that we need to remember. Okay? Let's start with number 1. Principle number 1 states that there is no absolute social interpretation. Ibig sabihin, different minds don't see a social event in the same way. Sa Tagalog, ibig sabihin yan, hindi pare-pareho ang tingin ng mga tao sa isang sitwasyon or iba-iba tayo ng take. Kapag merong nangyari sa ating social world, different people will see that event in different ways. Let me give you one example from the Bible para ma-demonstrate kung anong ibig sabihin ng principle 1. Let's say from the Bible, nangyari itong event na ito where Jesus was arrested from the Garden of Gethsemane. Ito yung sikat na halik ni Judas, di ba? Let's read that part in the Bible. Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. The man stepped forward to seize Jesus and arrested him. Yan yung social event na sinasabi ko. But as you will see in this slide and the next, yung iba't ibang mga characters in the Bible, iba-iba ang kanilang interpretation on that event. For Peter, with that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Ang interpretation ni Peter sa sitwasyon na ito is that this is a threat, this is a challenge to them as a group. So naging violent si Peter. But look at what Jesus did in this situation. Put your sword back in place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father and He will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Can you picture how Jesus was saying these words? Napakakalmado niya. Kasi ang take niya dito sa situation, ibang-iba compared kay Peter. How about the disciples na kasama ni Jesus Christ? Then all the disciples deserted Him and fled. So you see, again, the point here is those different characters in that social event, iba-iba sila ng take doon sa nangyari. For Peter, it was a challenge. For Jesus, itong event na ito is an opportunity, again, to show the miracle. Kaya niya sinuli yung tenga na naputol ni Peter. Okay? And for the disciples naman, ang interpretation nila, this is a danger, pwede nila itong ikapahamak. So, that explains why sila ay nagtakbuhan. But again, let's not forget the principle here. One social event can be interpreted in different ways by different people. In our everyday life, nangyayari din yan. For example, kapag nag-aaway ang isang boyfriend at ang isang girlfriend. Ang pinag-aawayan nila dito kasi, nalaman nung girl na yung boyfriend niya ay nagkaroon ng gatherings with his barkada. So, nagagalit yung girlfriend kasi hindi siya sinama nung kanyang boyfriend doon sa kanyang barkada moments. Okay? Now, why are they fighting in this situation? Because again, magkaiba sila ng take doon sa social event. What's the social event? The girlfriend was not invited to the boyfriend's friend's party. So, ang interpretation kasi nung girl, ang tingin niya doon sa situation is the boyfriend is not proud of her as his girlfriend. So, nasasaktan siya doon sa idea na yon, sa interpretation na yon na mukhang hindi ka yata proud na girlfriend ako at hindi mo ako sinama doon sa party ng barkada mo. Pero yung boyfriend naman, iba yung take. Ang take naman ng boyfriend, the reason why hindi ka sinama kasi ayaw kitang ma-out of place. 'Di ba? Yun naman yung take niya. Alam ko kasi na yung mga barkada ko hindi naman kayo masyadong close. So baka pag sinama kita doon ma-out of place ka lang, ayaw ko namang mararamdaman mo 'yon. So nanggagaling sila sa magkaibang social interpretation, and that is where their argument is coming from. Kaya nga paano mo aayusin to? We just go back to principle number 1. Ang kailangan na mangyari dito is the boyfriend and the girlfriend must show or must tell each other their social interpretation of the event. Dapat yung girl, ipaalam niya sa boyfriend niya ano kasi yung interpretation niya, and yung guy naman, ipaalam din niya doon sa girlfriend niya kung ano yung interpretation niya doon sa social event. And the thing is, when the girl and the guy nakita na nila yung kanyang-kanyang mga social interpretations, I guarantee yung kanilang argument in this situation ay bababa. Kasi yung ating emotions mas napapacify, mas nakokontrol when we know where the other person is coming from. And one effective way for us to know where the person is coming from is when we see or we understand what's their take in a social situation. Kaya yan yung dapat mangyari dito sa nag-aaway na boyfriend and girlfriend na ito. No? They have to understand their social interpretation of that common event. Now, let me just add one more idea under principle number 1. Ang sabi dito, humans act on their social interpretations. So, hindi lang pala tayo basta-basta nag-i-interpret ng mga social interpretations na nangyayari sa ating mundo, no? But whenever we have social interpretations, ginagamit natin yon for us to guide our behaviors. Kaya nga sabi dito, no, humans act on their social interpretation. Sa Tagalog, kumikilos ang tao ayon sa kanilang paniniwala. So, our interpretation, we always use that for us to determine how will we behave in that situation. Kaya nga, going back, dito sa nag-aaway na boyfriend and girlfriend na ito, 'di ba? Yung kanilang mga galit, nanggagaling 'yan sa kanilang social interpretation. Kaya galit si girlfriend kasi ang interpretation niya, hindi siya ginagawang special person ng boyfriend niya. Kaya siya nagagalit. Yung boyfriend naman, kaya siya nagagalit kasi feeling niya o yung interpretation niya, yung girlfriend is being immature kasi hindi naintindihan ng girl na kaya nga niya ginawa 'yon kasi para hindi siya ma-out of place. Dapat magpasalamat pa yung girl sa kanya. So again, yung kanya-kanyang mga galit nanggagaling sa kanilang kanya-kanyang mga social interpretation. That's what you mean by this sub-principle. Okay? Another example, going back to that story from the Bible na ginamit ko kanina, bakit ba si Peter ay nanaga ng tenga? Because of his social interpretation that this is a challenge to their group. Dahil nakita niya na mukhang china-challenge yung grupo nila Jesus, naging violent si Peter para ipagtanggol niya yung grupo niya. Why was Jesus very calm in this situation? Kasi yung interpretation ni Jesus sa event na ito is again an opportunity, or this event is something that must happen. This is God's will, 'di ba? Kasi kapag hindi nangyari ito, kapag hindi siya hinuli from the Garden of Gethsemane, hindi magkakaroon ng crucifixion. Kung walang crucifixion, hindi magkakaroon ng salvation, which is, in the first place, yan yung mission niya sa mundo. So, because Jesus knew that these things must happen, naging kalmado siya sa pag-respond dito sa social interpretation na ito. How about the disciples? Because they interpreted the social event as a danger to their lives, that explains their behavior of why they run away. Again, yung interpretation natin sa mga social events sa mundo natin, we always use that to guide our behaviors. That's why one good question that we can ask ourselves is this: how accurate is your social interpretation? Lalong-lalo na sa panahon ngayon, usong-uso yung mga fake news. Marami mga bagay na mukhang hindi naman totoo, pero pinaniniwalaan ng maraming tao, especially in the age of social media. Nagkalat talaga yung mga taong nagkakalat ng mga realities na hindi naman totoo. Now, you can only imagine what will happen to a person kapag meron siyang pinaniniwala ang reality na hindi pala totoo, na mali pala. Tapos ginagamit niya yung social interpretation na yon para i-guide yung kanyang behavior. That can be very dangerous, di ba? In the Bible, sabi doon, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end, it leads to death. Hindi yan yung nakakatakot, no? Meron tayong mga posibleng mga social reality. The way we interpret certain events, yung pinaniniwalaan pala nating social reality mali. So, yung interpretation din natin, mali rin. At dahil dyan, yung behavior natin, mali rin. Diba? Kaya nga dyan nanggaling yung maraming namamatay sa maling akala. You can only imagine if you are acting on a social event that is false, you are acting on a social interpretation that is wrong, it can lead you to death. Baka ikapahamak mo yan. One good example of this would be yung napaka-popular na fairy tale, The Little Red Riding Hood. Diba? Akala ni little girl dito, ni Red Riding Hood, akala niya yung matanda na nakikita niya, grandma niya. Yun pala, mali ang kanyang interpretation, yun pala yung wolf. That's why in the end, ikinapahamak niya yan, nakain tuloy siya ng buo. And the same thing with our everyday life. The same thing with our psychological life. Our life can be messed up when we believe in things na hindi naman pala totoo. And when we use those things na pinaniniwalaan nating totoo to guide our behaviors, doon tayo nagkakaroon ng kapahamakan. That's why one lesson that we can learn from this principle is there are many versions to one story. Before we react, before we create a behavior out of our own social interpretation, kinakailangan alamin muna natin yung whole story. Alamin muna natin yung talagang totoo. Let's first make sure na yung pinaniniwalaan natin na yung social interpretation natin is the truth. And once we are sure that what we are believing in is true, then that's the only time na pwede tayong mag-generate ng behavior from that social truth. Kasi, again, inuulit-ulit ko na nga, masama, very dangerous yung gumawa tayo ng mga behaviors na base sa isang social truth, quote-unquote social truth, na mali naman pala. Diba? Sabi nga ng isang author, which is very related to what I'm saying right now, I don't care if you're going to tell everyone what I have done to you, but please just don't forget to tell them what you did to me. There are always two sides in one story. And before we react, before we make conclusions, before we make judgments, dapat narinig natin yung lahat ng sides ng story. Kailangan sinigurado natin na lahat ng pinaniniwalaan natin is actually the truth. Let's move on to principle number 2. External forces influence social interpretations. Saan ba nanggagaling in the first place yung ating mga social interpretations that we have about the world? One answer, from external forces. Sabi ni John Paul Sartre, humans are first of all beings in a situation. We cannot be distinguished from our situations, for they form us and decide our possibilities. I would like you to focus on those words in yellow: situation, form us, and decide our possibilities. Ibig sabihin, merong mga external forces sa labas natin, sa labas ng mind natin, that determines kung anong klaseng social reality yung pinaniniwalaan natin. Let's be more specific. What are some examples of these external forces na nakakaapekto sa ating social behaviors? Number one, syempre nandyan ang mga tao na nakapaligid sa atin, di ba? So, how we view the world, how we interpret social events depends on what kind of people are surrounding us. Halimbawa, bakit maraming tao naniniwala na wala namang problema sa bisyo? Bakit maraming tao na sa tingin nila yung pagkakaroon ng bisyo is just one way to enjoy life? Well, the answer is, posible kasi na yung kanilang mga kaibigan na binavalue, ganun din ang paniniwala. Kaya ang ending, yung iyong social interpretation about having vices is very positive. The same thing for example in homosexuality. Diba? Why would a person believe na okay lang ikasal ang homosexuals? Why would a person be very accepting of people who are homosexuals? Ang sagot dyan, most likely, marami kasi siyang mga kaibigan na homosexuals din. And vice versa, what would make a person anti-gay? Bakit siya galit sa mga gays? Ang sagot dyan, posibleng marami din siya mga kaibigan o baka kaanib siya sa isang grupo who is also anti-gay. The point here is, again, the number of people or the people who surround us can highly influence the way we interpret social events. Kaya nga, again, in the Bible, sinasabi sa Proverbs, di ba? He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Yung mga taong nakapaligid sa iyo, malaki ang epekto nila in the way you will see the social world. Number 2 will be historical events. The reason why iba-iba tayo ng interpretation sa ating social world kasi magkakaiba tayo ng history. Magkakaiba tayo ng mga karanasan na mayroon in the past. For example, what would make a person hate the Muslims? One reason, siguro meron kasi siyang karanasan during 9/11. 'Di ba? Siguro nandoon siya sa building na gumuho, nakasurvive lang siya, at nung nalaman niya na yung karamihan pala ng mga may kagagawan ng 9/11 attack ay mga Muslim, then that explains why that person would hate the Muslims. In the Philippine setting, why would some people hate the Marcoses? The reason, meron kasi silang personal historical experience during the martial law. So napakasama siguro nung kanilang experience during the martial law, and because of that, that explains why they hate or they don't respect the Marcoses, di ba? And if you're going to study the history of the martial law, kung ano ba yung mga nangyari during those times, especially to the victims of the martial law, you will understand why these people would hate certain people. Diba? Again, your personal history can determine how you see social events. Number 3, nandyan din yung role ng kultura. Diba? What do you mean by culture? Ito yung mga common patterns of how we think or how we behave in a certain situation. Culture is being learned. Different places have different cultures. Therefore, you can also assume na ang iba't ibang mga tao, meron din silang mga natutunang iba't ibang mga kultura. And these differences in culture can determine also why we behave socially in different ways. Halimbawa, yung ating pagkain. Diba? Iba-iba tayo ng paraan kung paano tayo kumain, and that can be explained by culture. For example, ito, napakasikat na example ko na to, no? Yung pagkain ng noodles. Diba? Yung pagkain ng maingay. In the Chinese culture, when you do that, kumakain ka ng maingay, in their culture, it means you are appreciating the person who cooked the food for you. Parang it's their non-verbal way of saying na masarap ang luto mo, na maingay siya kumain. But of course, in our culture, diba, we are taught na kapag tayo ay kumakain, dapat tahimik lang. In fact, in our culture, kapag maingay tayo kumain, ang tawag natin dyan, bad manners. Again, one social event, pagkain. Pero magkaiba tayo ng interpretation. Some believe na ang pagkain ng maingay okay lang. Some believe ang pagkain ng maingay it's bad manners. What explains that? None other than the culture. And take note, yung sinabi ko dito, dalawa pa lang yan, no? Filipino culture and the Chinese culture. Iba pa ang take ng iba't ibang mga kultura sa pagkain. Iba ang take ng mga Kano, iba ang take ng mga taga-Iceland, iba ang take ng mga taga-Brazil, so on and so forth. So again, it's very important for us. One way to understand a person better, bakit ba siya ganun mag-behave in the social world, is to understand what culture that person has learned. Diba? So kung gusto mong mas umintindi ng tao, bakit siya ganito, bakit siya ganon, intindihin mo yung kultura na pinanggalingan niya. Number 4, another external force that determines kung bakit iba-iba tayo ng interpretation sa social event is none other than the outside appearance, o sa Tagalog, itsura. 'Di ba? Kung paano ka magbe-behave towards someone, wag na tayo mag-deny dito, nakadepende rin 'yan doon sa itsura ng mga tao that we are interacting with. You know, why would you be nice with one person and you are not so nice with another person? Ang sagot dyan, dahil din sa itsura nila yan. Most likely, kapag ikaw ay nakikipag-interact sa isang mayaman, sa isang VIP, may-ari ng isang hotel, o siya yung may-ari ng eskwelahan mo, most likely, pagkausap mo yung taong yan, napaka-respectful mo. Punong-puno siguro yung bibig mo ng po at opo at talagang nag-uumapaw ka sa paggalang. But for example, kapag kumausap ka naman ng isang tao na hindi naman ganun ka big time, mahirap lang, hindi siya masyadong ma-impluwensya, I don't think that you will act in the same way as when you were acting with the VIP a while ago. And you should not feel bad about that kasi ganun naman talaga yung ating tendency, no? That's the tendency of the mind. It will base how it behaves on the physical appearance of those people who we are interacting with. Kaya alam nyo, one lesson that we can learn here from principle number 2 is most social behaviors are externally triggered. Marami tayong mga bagay na ginagawa sa ating mga buhay na tinitrigger lang tayo kaya natin nagagawa. And I think this is good news, especially when we talk about bad habits. Marami tayong mga bad habits, marami tayong mga undesirable behaviors na ginagawa natin because we are simply triggered to do those things. And this is good news because that means triggers can be controlled. Diba? As you can see on the slide, no? Kapag ayaw mo nang gawin yung mga bad behaviors na ginagawa mo, ang gagawin mo lang is hanapin mo yung trigger na yon and then do something about that trigger para hindi siya magtutulak sa'yo na gumawa ng mga behaviors na ayaw mong gawin in the first place. And I hope you understand why in the Bible, again, over and over again, sinasabi that Christians should not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? Yan yung sinasabi sa Bible. Kasi kapag yung isang Christian, dikit siya ng dikit sa mga non-Christians, yung mga non-Christians nagiging trigger sila para yung Christians gumawa ng mga bagay na taliwa sa kanilang paniniwala. That's why one lesson that we can learn here is we need to really be choosy when it comes to who we are going to interact with. Because those people, ang mga tao talaga sila yung pinakamakapangyarihang triggers eh. 'Di ba? Kapag pinaliligiran ka ng mga tao na gumagawa ng isang bagay, napaka-powerful na trigger 'yan for you to do that same behavior. 'Di ba? Bakit ba hirap na hirap kang itigil yung pag-iinom-inom mo? The answer, because you are surrounding yourself with people who are triggering you para uminom. 'Di ba? Paano yung barkada mong umiinom, 10 sila, lahat sila umiinom, tapos lagi mo silang kasama, no wonder they are always triggering you to drink. Kaya kahit anong control mo, kahit anong try mo na makawala sa bisyo mo, hindi ka makawala kasi hindi mo naman inaayos o hindi ka naman tumatakas doon sa mga triggers mo. That is why one very important psychological skill that I think every person should learn how to do is to eliminate their triggers. I-eliminate natin yung mga triggers natin that lead us to do negative behaviors. Halimbawa, ito, yung mga nasa slide, no? Ano ba ang trigger ng laziness mo in the first place? Bakit ka ba tinatamad mag-aral? Most students I know, ang trigger nila, bakit sila tinatamad mag-aral is yung kanilang kama. Every time they come from school, they enter their bedroom, and then hihiga sila doon sa kama nila. Alam naman nilang kailangan nilang mag-review, but that bed is a trigger for their laziness. Kaya ang effective way para ma-overcome mo yung laziness, alisin mo yung trigger mo. So, ibig sabihin ba nun, alisin mo yung kama mo? Well, if you're really serious about overcoming your trigger, then pwede mong alisin yung kama mo. Or for example, kung talagang gusto mong mag-aral bago ka magpahinga at hindi ka atakihin ng katamaran, what you can do is when you enter the house from school, huwag ka munang pumunta doon sa bedroom mo. Ang gawin mo, buksan mo na kaagad yung mga libro mo, buksan mo na kaagad yung mga assignments mo, mag-aral ka doon sa dining room. Para maiwasan mo yung trigger mo na kama na magti-trigger lang sa'yo na maging tamad or antukin at matulog na lang. Okay? Another example would be, what's the trigger for dishonesty? Especially for students who are taking tests, di ba? Ang isang estudyante, kaya naman niya nagkakaroon ng habit ng pangongopya kasi meron silang trigger in the environment while they are taking tests. Ang isang estudyante, hindi naman mangongopya yan kung wala siyang trigger towards cheating Kaya meron akong isang teacher na kilala, one way para ma-eliminate niya yung triggers ng kanyang mga estudyante at hindi sila magkopyahan, ganyan ang ginawa niya sa kanyang mga estudyante. Diba? If you can see right here. Yan. Diba? Ewan ko na lang kung magkopyahan pa sila. By doing this, the teacher was able to eliminate the trigger that makes the students cheat during an exam. And last one, principle number 3 in social psychology, although meron tayong mga external forces that affects our social behavior, meron din naman tayong mga internal forces. Ibig sabihin, meron din tayong mga bagay sa loob natin that will affect or that will influence how we will behave socially. Like what? Some examples of internal factors would be number 1, our personal beliefs. Sa Tagalog, yung ating mga paniniwala. Diba? Our belief inside our heads are so powerful na yung mga beliefs na yan sa loob ng ating mind, hindi lang sila basta-basta nandito sa mind natin, but those beliefs influence our behaviors, di ba? Kaya nga in the Bible, paulit-ulit na sinasabi ng Proverbs, more than anything you guard, protect your mind, for life flows from it. Ibig sabihin, yung mga belief natin na nilalagay natin sa mind natin, doon nang gagaling yung ating mga social behaviors. So whether you will be nice to a person or you will be not nice to a person, depende yan sa mga bagay na pinaniniwalaan mo inside your head. Let me give you some examples how this works. Kapag naniniwala ka na merong forever, ibig sabihin naniniwala ka sa true love, you believe that God has someone for you to marry in the future, how does that affect your behavior? More likely, maniniwala ka sa kasal. At dahil naniniwala ka sa kasal, most likely, ikakasal ka rin in the future. So what explains why two people get married? Because these two people both believe na meron talagang forever. Na meron talagang taong nakatakda o itinakda si God para sa isa't isa. So when you believe that idea, you are more likely to get married. Vice versa, kapag naniniwala ka naman na sasaktan ka lang ng mga lalaki or genuine relationships don't really work, most likely ang behavior mo dyan, magiging happy ka, maging single. Less likely kang ikakasal kasi every time na merong magyayaya sa'yo na magpakasal, iisipin mo, babalik ka lang dun sa belief mo na wala talagang true love, ang ending lagi mong tina-turn down yung mga taong nagyayaya sa'yong magpakasal. So again, the point here is our beliefs are so powerful in influencing our social behaviors. Aside from our beliefs, meron pa tayong isa. Ito yung tinatawag nating biology or our body or physical forces, di ba? Meron tayong mga bagay sa ating mga katawan that can highly influence the way we behave in the social world. Tulad ng genes, hormones, and of course, our brain. Let me just give you some examples kung papaano ang mga bagay na ito can affect our social behaviors. Yung pagiging mainitin ng ulo. Bakit merong mga drivers na sobrang mainitin ng ulo at sila yung mga drivers who are always involved in road rages, di ba? When you read the news, when you surf the net, lalong-lalo na makinig ka ng bitag o makinig ka ng Tulfo shows, no? You will see a lot of people who are really going wild on the streets. What explains that? One possible reason na mana nila genetically yung kanilang pagiging hot-headed. Kasi napatunayan naman talaga sa marami mga pag-aaral that one of the personality traits that is very highly heritable is our temperament. So that means, kapag ikaw ay hot-tempered, talagang mabilis kang mainis, mabilis kang mairita, mabilis uminit ang ulo mo, most likely namana mo yan from your parents, and those genes that you inherited from your parents explain why you are having road rage. Another example is bakit may ibang mga tao napaka-religyoso. 'Di ba? Some people even call them religious fanatics, 'di ba? Tulad nga nung dito sa screen na nakikita nyo, why would a person behave this way? One answer has something to do with your brain. Kasi sabi ng modern biological psychology, nakita nila yung part of the brain that is responsible for making a person very spiritual or very religious. So, merong isang part ng brain na kapag very active yan sa isang tao, makakaasa ka that that person will be very religious. And they believe that this part of the brain being active, it is actually inborn. Ibig sabihin, nung pinanganak sila, yung parte ng brain na yan very active na, predisposing them to be very religious or to be very spiritual. Okay? So, in summary, ano yung 3 social psychology principles na pinag-usapan natin ngayon? Number 1, there is no absolute social interpretation. Iba-iba tayo ng take sa mga social events. Number 2, external forces influence social interpretations. And number 3, internal forces influence our social behaviors. Now, before we end this lecture on this topic in social psychology, syempre, pinaka-importante pag-usapan natin is ano ngayon? So what? Ano yung mga bagay na pwede nating magamit sa lesson na ito to make our interactions with other people better? Let me share with you the following. Number 1, I hope you realize that the more you see others' interpretations, the better your relationship, or you become a more socially attractive person. 'Di ba? Ito yung nanggaling sa principle number 1, no? Kapag magaling ka sa pag-acknowledge, magaling ka sa pag-identify ng social interpretation ng ibang tao, most likely mas nagiging okay yung relationship mo. Because believe it or not, that is a very important psychological skill. Being able to see the interpretation of other people towards a social event. Ang tawag natin dyan in a more technical term is empathy. Diba? You can see the perspective of another person. And empathy is written in the Bible. Diba? Sinasabi rin ng Bible na nakakaganda ng relationship kapag nagpa-practice ka ng empathy. In Philippians chapter 2 verse 4, each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. So when you know how to acknowledge where the person is coming from, ina-acknowledge mo yung social interpretation niya, and you make that person feel na naiintindihan mo kung bakit siya nagbe-behave ng ganon, kung bakit siya nagre-react ng ganon, then most likely, you are improving your relationship with that person. You become more socially attractive because studies show in the psychology of human attraction na isa sa mga qualities ng mga tao o ng isang tao na gustong-gusto ng lahat ng tao towards someone is empathy. Someone who knows how to empathize. Kaya ang mga taong magaling mag-empathize, alam nyo, marami silang mga constructive and fruitful social relationships. So if you want to improve your social life, if you want to be more socially attractive in the eyes of other people, one way to do it is to practice principle number 1. Alamin mo o i-acknowledge mo yung social interpretation ng ibang tao. This is one book that I would highly recommend that you can read for you to improve your relationship with other people, especially of the opposite sex. Dito sa libro na ito ni John Gray, pinapaliwanag niya kung paano ba mag-isip ang lalaki versus paano mag-isip ang isang babae. Whether you're a guy or a girl, when you read this book, ang nakukuha mo dito is nagkakaroon ka ng ability to understand the social interpretation of the opposite sex. And the more you understand how the opposite sex thinks, the better your relationship will be to the opposite sex. So again, I highly recommend for those of you na in a relationship or marami kayo mga friends na girls or guys or of the opposite sex and you want to understand them better, you read this book. Okay? Number 2. Another application that we can learn in today's discussion is better psychological life means effective management of negative triggers. I think binanggit ko na ito kanina, di ba? Karamihan ng mga behaviors nating hindi maganda are just triggered by external forces that are found outside our minds. 'Di ba? Tulad ng mga bisyo, unhealthy diet, or our bad habits, 'di ba? Karamihan sa mga bad behaviors na 'yan, we are just triggered to do these behaviors. Let's be more specific with the bad habits, 'di ba? O, karamihan ng mga bad habits natin, again, we have those habits because we are just triggered by external forces outside the mind. But again, let me just repeat, sinabi ko kanina, isa sa mga pinakamakapangyarihan na trigger ng behavior, ng social behavior ng tao is none other than other people. 'Di ba? Kapag pinapaligiran mo yung sarili mo ng mga tao na negative ang trigger na binibigay sa iyo, most likely you are also going to do negative behaviors. Panay ang lasing mo, panay ang uwi mo ng late, panay ang pagdadrugs mo because you are surrounding yourself with people who are also like that. 'Di ba? Sila yung nagiging trigger ng mga bisyo mo. Kaya sabi nga ni Jim Rohn, 'di ba? You are the average of the 5 people you spend your most time with. And this is very biblical. Proverbs tells us, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Kaya again, dapat ang application natin dito is maging maingat tayo sa pagpili ng mga tao sa paligid natin because these are the people who will give us the triggers that will determine our social behaviors. Kung gusto nating umayos yung buhay natin, humanap tayo ng mga tao na magagandang trigger ang binibigay sa atin. Tinitrigger tayo magbasa ng Bible, tinitrigger tayong maging mapasensyoso, tinitrigger tayong maging masipag. Yan yung mga taong dapat sinasamahan natin. You need to learn how to effectively manage your triggers. And last one, number 3, another application that we can learn today is you need to understand people's social behaviors internally. Ibig sabihin, may mga pagkakataon na one way to better understand a person is to figure out what is happening inside this person. So, other than the trigger, kasi, di ba, one way para maintindihan mo yung tao, tignan mo yung mga external forces niya. Sino ba yung mga kasama niya? Ano ba yung mga librong binabasa niya? Ano ba yung mga TV shows na pinapanood niya? Although that will work. But again, meron tayo mga triggers na deep inside us. Di ba? Like, for example, yung mga nagsusungit. You know? Ito, nakikita nyo dito sa screen, diba? Yung mga nagsusungit. Marami mga tao na apektuhan kapag sinusungitan sila. You know? And they attribute yung pagiging masungit badly doon sa nagsusungit. Kaya ayaw na natin makipag-interact to that person who is masungit. But guess what? We have to understand that there are certain situations where these people are masungit because of internal forces within them. Believe it or not, kaya siya masungit, it has nothing to do with you. 'Di ba? Hindi ka naman naging hindi ka naman naging masama sa kanya or wala ka naman ginawa para maging masungit siya. Masungit lang talaga siya. Merong mga internal forces within that person na nagsusuporta doon sa kanyang pagiging masungit. Siguro, isa sa mga belief systems niya, sungitan mo yung mga taong hindi mo kakilala o sungitan mo yung mga taong hindi mo ka-close. 'Di ba? So kapag sinungitan ka ng isang tao, huwag mong isipin na it has something to do with you. Kasi wala kang pera, kaya ka sinungitan, o kaya kasi hindi ka pogi, hindi ka maganda, kaya ka sinungitan. Sinungitan ka niya kasi naniniwala siya that one way to protect herself from strangers is sungitan sila. Diba? That is her way of establishing wall between her and other people. Dadaanin niya sa sungit. So, it has nothing to do with you. It has something to do with her, kaya siya masungit. Or, isang reason kung bakit masungit yung nakausap mo, meron kasing biological na nangyayari sa kanya. Nagpi-PMS pala siya, no? Premenstrual syndrome. This is a time during the girl's menstrual cycle where their hormones are very unstable. At isa sa mga resulta, isa sa mga epekto kapag unstable yung hormones mo is ang mga babaeng nagpi-PMS madalas irritable, nagsusungit. 'Di ba sabi nga ni Chinkitan, no? Ang mga taong galit ay may pinaguhugutan, huwag mong patulan. So yan yung isang skill yan, believe it or not. Yung huwag mo na lang patulan yung isang taong nagsusungit because for all you know, the negative behavior that person is showing to you, it has nothing to do with you. It has something to do with that person with that negative emotion. Meron siyang pinagdaraanang internal. Okay? So, again, i-summarize lang natin ano yung mga applications na pwede natin gamitin to improve our relationship with others. Number 1, the more you see others' interpretations, the better your relationship or you become more socially attractive. So, pag-aralan mo kung paano tignan ang perspective ng ibang tao. Number 2, better psychological life means effective management of negative triggers. Identify mo what are these triggers that are leading you to do unhealthy behaviors, and then if possible, you get rid of those triggers. So tanggalin mo muna yung kama mo sa kwarto mo, okay, para hindi ka atakihin ng katamaran. And number 3, understand people's social behaviors internally. Marami mga tao, gumagawa sila ng mga bagay na ayaw natin, but it has nothing to do with us. They are doing those negative behaviors simply because there are internal things happening to them. And we have to understand those internal events na pinagdaraanan nila. So I hope this lesson, marami kayong natutunan on how to improve your relationship with other people. Because again, basically, social psychology is all about that. We study influence, how a person influence others and how other people influence the person. But regardless, itong mga sinabi ko sa inyo ngayon na mga lessons, you can use these principles to better improve your relationship with other people. Until next time, God